Welcome everyone. أهلا وسهلا جميعا. For those of you who need interpretation, this event will be in English and Arabic is available, so you can click on the interpretation button in the lower right-hand side of the screen. يلي حابب ينضم إلينا ويتسمع على الترجمة الفورية هي موجودة حاليا.
Interpretation is available in English and Arabic. You can click on the globe at the bottom of the page and choose Arabic for Arabic and English for English interpretation. Welcome everyone.
My name is Sarine Karajerjian. I'm Program Director of the Environmental Politics Program at the Arab Reform Initiative. We are delighted to hosting you to our 6th event of this year on environmental politics in the MENA region, where we bring together researchers, activists, advocates, journalists, and scholars from the region to discuss pertinent issues that address the environment and that affects our region. Today, all over the region, we've seen climate activists, they have cooperated with international organizations such as Greenpeace or the World Wildlife Fund in order to advance their shared agenda, and have used international conferences like the Conference of Parties to present their findings to the whole world. However, and ultimately, there is an inherent friction between the economic of the developing world and the environmental concerns of the developed world. So to what extent is it fair to impose restrictions and even regulations on countries that desperately need the revenue from fossil fuel extraction to improve their own finances and also their livelihoods? One must remember Western countries once had their own industrial revolution, which gave them their dominant place in the world. And now they are pushing from other countries' industrial development under the guise of environmentalism. So this COP27, which is taking place between the 7th and the 17th of November in Sharm el-Sheikh, with an agenda divided by thematic and sectoral days. So around finance, science and youth, decarbonization, adaptation, culture, gender, water, air, and energy and biodiversity, with the final day related to finding solutions. So the Egyptian president's decision to endorse the transformation of Glasgow pledges into fulfillment 4 goals during the negotiations. 1, to review and increase the nationally determined contributions, ambitions on mitigation. 2, place adaptation at the forefront of climate action. 3, improve clarity and commitments on green finance, which is something that we've seen a lot and we've discussed a lot around this particular COP. And finally, facilitate agreements during the negotiations. Thus, one question, what is the COP's final responsibility in all of this? And how can it serve as a network to boost cooperation between countries, with some of them occasionally have unfriendly diplomatic relations, especially as they often face similar ecological problems? How could the current climate arrangements be redefined to create a better and fairer situation? And how can climate injustice, the fact that the biggest offenders are not as affected as countries with a negligible climate impact, be a cause for reassessment of relations between the global north and the global south? And some of the questions that we will hear from panelists are: what are the opportunities or lack of opportunities for climate and advocates or activists, as we can say, to get involved, and what are their demands in this specific in Sharm el-Sheikh? How can climate advocates mobilize to bring forth the issue of climate change? What are the reparations? Should advocates make in the case of loss and damage policy? So today's webinar will address all these issues with our 4 speakers from the region who will be joining the Conference of the Parties this November in Sharm el-Sheikh. Our first speaker for today is Maymoona Abu-omair. Maymoona is an advocate for climate action in the Middle East and North Africa. She's currently leading the coordination of monitoring, evaluation, and learning activities in the USAID-funded project MENA Youth for Climate Action, which is an organization that supports youth-led and youth-serving organizations in the climate space through climate financing and supporting their own environmental projects. Our second speaker is Rayan Kassem. He is the West Asia Regional Director of Youth for Nature. Rayan has been supporting the global climate and food systems youth for more than 2 years now, and he has been advocating for policy reforms with policymakers and other stakeholders at relevant events by building capacity of the youth. Our third is Hafsa Halawa. Hafsa is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East and is an independent consultant working on political, social, economic affairs across the MENA and the Horn of Africa. And our last speaker is Mohamed Kamal. He's a public health engineer with solid waste management and plastic pollution. Mohamed is currently the co-director of organization, which is an organization that works on environmental awareness in Egypt, on education and on advocacy. And Mohamed has actively been engaged on plastic pollution related to projects in Egypt. And currently working on civil society organizations and advocacy for the engagement and their own engagement at the COP27. So I will give the floor to our first speaker, Maymoona, and then anyone from the audience can ask questions on the chat in English or in Arabic, and we will make sure to open up the discussion. Each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. Maymoona, tfaddali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarine, and thank you for this opportunity to come and speak alongside those very amazing speakers from all over the region. And thank you for all the introductions. For me, I would like to talk more about, climate finance, especially that there is this surge towards focusing on loss and damage finance, adaptation finance, and mitigation finance in this upcoming COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. So, and just a little bit of a background information in the UNFCCC, climate finance means local, national, or international financing drawn from public, private, or any alternative source of finance that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions, which will address climate change. And the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement, all of them, they call for financial assistance from parties with more financial resources, the richer nations, to those that are less endowed and more vulnerable, especially in the global south. And this recognizes that the contribution of countries to climate change and their capacity to prevent it and cope with its consequences vary enormously. And one of the principles that we know of the convention is common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. And according to that, developed countries parties are to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties in implementing the objectives of the UNFCCC. And by the way, that is the least that they could do as we know, the developed countries are kind of like the biggest contributors to the climate crisis. And to facilitate the provision of climate finance, the convention established a financial mechanism to provide financial resources to developing country parties. And at COP16 in 2010, parties established the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. And in 2011, this fund was designated as an operating entity of the financial mechanism. And the financial mechanism, by the way, is accountable to the COP, which decides on its policies, program priorities, and eligibility criteria for funding. But donor nations have mostly avoided providing climate finance through these channels, by the way, preferring to fund countries directly through, for instance, multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank. In COP26 last year, it ended with a historic commitment, if I can call it that, by richer nations to provide low and middle income countries with 40 billion US dollars annually in adaptation finance from 2025. Why? First of all, 40 billion is a small fraction of what is needed for communities to protect themselves adequately from severe climate impacts. However, this commitment, I can say it is really important because it was a way of the global north to admit that adaptation finance in particular is not very popular among funders, because most funders prefer mitigation projects, not adaptation. And so that's why the vast majority of financing goes to, as loans, by the way, to mitigation projects, simply because the return is better and it is easier to do, which will make funders look good to the global community. And now mitigation projects help stave off the worst impacts of the climate change, for example, by installing solar panels to reduce fossil fuel use, projects from which funders can expect a return because they're, first of all, loans, and they're very attractive as investments. By contrast, adaptation schemes like flood defenses, like for instance, flood defenses, are best done, by the public sector, and that is a very little of a very little interest to donor nations. So I'm not gonna talk a lot about this, but a major point of contention is the fact that more than 80% of climate finance applied to developing countries comprises loans. So, and the proportion of climate funding given as grants, not loans, is falling very vastly. And, the trend towards loans is very problematic because, loans need to be repaid with interest, and because they tend to be provided for projects that can demonstrate a return on investment. So basically, loans are less likely to be obtained for projects, that are designed to help countries become more resilient but do not make money. So, 13 years ago at COP15, as we know, in Copenhagen, rich nations made a significant pledge. They promised to channel $100 billion a year to less wealthy nations by 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further, rises in temperature. And despite the collective agreements, richer countries made no formal deal on what each should pay. Instead, countries announced pledges in the hopes that, others will follow. And, this alone tells us how the global north, the biggest contributor to climate change, owes the global south, the most affected nations by climate change, a lot. Not only did developed nations target the global south lands for carbon market offsets and unsustainable abusive business, but they're also refusing to help finance the mitigation and adaptation efforts. And all we got so far is empty promises that are broken among annual COPs that leave people even more tense each year as we run out of time. And, people on planet should be at the center, of the global political agenda and humanities concerns. And as climate action advocates, as myself, I fail to understand why all of those COPs and we're still, we don't have an actual action plan that we can call, an action plan. It's just, empty promises here and there with no vision to the future. And I hope that, the global north recognizes the abuse and the consequences of destroying those natural ecosystems. And the least that they could do now is own up to their promises and pledges. And one final thought, indigenous communities should be at the head of the negotiations as they experience firsthand the impact of the climate crisis on their lives. And they should be able to confront political leaders with their first-hand experience of struggles for climate, economic, and also racial justice. Thank you, Wael. Sarine, back to you.
Thank you, Maymoona, for the global perspective around the COP, and also looking at issues of difference between grants and loans. That we will come back to this for sure during the questions, and who's responsible also of managing financial mechanisms. We will go to Rayan as a second speaker, and as well as, since you also will be taking part of the COP, what are the expectations? What are your demands? What are the issues that you are facing to the COP, and what will happen post-COP, and the different demands that your organization and the society movements that you're part of will be addressing? Rayan,
right. Thank you so much. I think what Maymoona raises is really important, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes. Let me bring you the practical information about COP27 from a young person's perspective, or not mine, but what the youth movement is talking about. I'm going to talk about logistics, the youth activities at COP27, and the expectations of young people for COP27. So for logistics, let's just start off with some good news. Let's just stop here. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories, negativity around this COP. Let me just start with the good news, so that everybody kind of has a good outlook. Number one, we've been receiving a lot of financial subsidies and support for African young people to go to COP27. Since there has been this fight about, is this an Arab COP or is this an African COP? Doesn't matter. Probably the Africans want it. Who cares? A lot of young Africans are being supported financially by global youth-led organizations to go to COP, specifically for Africans. So this is good. This is a good sign. Second, the COP presidency has officially released that they will subsidize the accommodation costs for over 400 young people attending COP27 through the Youth for Climate, I think, initiative. I think spots are running out. There was an application form for young people to submit in case they want to take advantage of those 400 seats. I didn't hear about that last year. This year, I am hearing about it. It's good. Over 400 young people will be supported. It's great. Third, I don't know if this is important for you or not, but in case it's relevant, Egypt Air is providing 20% off for flight tickets from specific cities around the world, in case you're coming to Sharm el-Sheikh or not. So this is also good. Fourth, we have the first ever youth and children's pavilion at COP, the first ever. My organization is part of the coordinating team that is responsible for this pavilion. So this is good, young people. First time ever, your own pavilion, your own spot to hang out, your own space, your own safe spot to speak what you want. There is also 2 or maybe 3 with the FAO, first ever food systems pavilions, which is also great. Last year really pushed the agenda for food systems. This year we actually have their own food systems pavilions. Those are organized by Climb Eat, ProVag, and the FAO. 6, there's a youth day. Take advantage of it. There's a lot of things going on that day. And 7th is there's actually over 136 accredited youth organizations for COP27 this year. Now, let's talk about the bad side. These are just facts, statistics. Receive them as you wish. I'm just here to share what the youth movement is saying. We all know this year there has been less badges given to all organizations around the world. So that's kind of on the bad side, less badges, less people going there. Second is the Egyptian government has increased taxes on all hotels and Airbnbs just for the duration of COP27, raising some really red flags about how inclusive COPs are and whether this is an economic opportunity to have a conference in your country and celebrate it while intentionally trying to make money out of taxes. No comment, just telling you what's going on here. Third, the Coca-Cola sponsorship of COP27. I don't think I really need to speak a lot about this. We all know Coca-Cola's greenwashing around the world, a huge red flag and setback for COP27 presidency of accepting to have Coca-Cola being the official sponsorship. Why? I mean, just why? Last but not least, which is the most important logistic concern for all young people, is safety concerns about Egypt. I could talk a lot about this, but a lot of young people are concerned about attending Egypt, given that it's a conservative society, that the Arab Spring, there were some violences like around that it's a developing country, that LGBTQ rights might not be accepted or respected while demonstrating. All of these concerns are being spoken a lot about internally, and there are actually trainings for safety, like, hey, delegations have some money on the side in case your delegates go to jail or in case they're not allowed to return to their countries. What will the Egyptian police do to us? Will they beat us? Should we take some protection? Stuff like that. And I think there's a lot of psychological misconceptions based on the developing world or Egypt or religions or whatever. I am not representing Egypt here. I know nothing about this. But I can say that us as a youth movement have reached out to the COP presidency, especially the youth envoy, stating that there are major safety concerns that young people are talking about, and that, I mean, the minimum that you owe them is to go publicly on video and say, hey, you're afraid, here's what we're gonna do to ensure that you're safe. Or, hey, these are misconceptions about the Egyptian culture, you know? This is the minimum that you could do. I haven't seen that being done. Anyway, logistics done. Let's talk about youth activities. Again, positive and negative stuff. For the first time ever, we have the Youth Climate Negotiator program, which is a program to train young people to be official negotiators of their governments. The Arab world, where do they sit? We have Lebanon, Jordan, and Libya having 333 young people being trained to be official badge holders as governments. I don't know about the financial status of these governments. I know that in Lebanon, UNICEF will be trying to support the young people to go to COP. I don't know about Libya and Jordan, but this is really good. It's really good. Second, the Youth Pavilion has over 500 applications. You can just imagine the immense amount of youth-led organizations that are be there representing and highlighting what they've done. Also, hundreds of youth-led events at other pavilions on the Youth Day as well. So keep that in mind. There's the Extreme Hangout, which is Extreme is like it's a company that makes outdoor clothing. They're also having their own youth-led day, which is great. Expectations. Let's move to expectations. The focus is on results. I think, as Maymoona said, there's always this pledge, 100 billion a year, whatever, less than 10% is always being given every year. So forget the pledges, we want results. Not only results, this year we're coming with a very critique mindset with the movement. I think they're a bit fed up. No more ambitions. We don't care about your ambitions. I think last year they were fighting who's going to become climate neutral 2050, 2040, 2035. Nobody really cares anymore. What we want to see is a progress tracker. Give us a transparent, digital and free platform online for your government or for whoever you are to show the progress with actual evidence that you're going from 1% to 3% to 5%. Show us the evidence. We no longer want you to give us pledges. We're fine if you give 10% pledge, but do it. So show us the progress. This is what we're here to demand this year. There will be a takeover demonstration of youth power through the Youth Pavilion. We think that there's going to be massive power for young people to show, hey, policymakers, you always tell us, you talk too much, but you can't handle being on the seat with policymakers. I think this is a great spot for young people to show, this is what we've done for the past years. Come and take a look at it. These are our results. We deserve to be there. Focus will be climate justice, food systems. I'm not gonna be talking about this because Maymoona spoke a little bit about climate finance, stuff like that. We can speak about thematic areas later. There's this pessimistic thing going on about Saudi Arabia. They want to host the Winter Olympics in the next years. Winter, Saudi Arabia, I think the message is clear. Perfect. And yes, COP27, COP28, Egypt, United Arab Emirates. I think this is a great chance for us to highlight and demand more for Arab countries as young people, just because the space is there, everything is going on. The Egyptian government, the United Arab governments, they're hosting the session, so they want to make a good impression. So I think this is a good ground for us to negotiate or ask or demand more funding, more support to young people. Let me just stop there. I know like my other colleagues have a lot of things to say, and then we can jump to questions later. Back to you, Sarine.
Thank you, Rayan, for bringing as well, the paradoxical image that that this COP is actually taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh, in a resort far away from the real Egypt, if we can say. So moving on to that, and maybe also we'll see, are you going yourself as a youth, as your organization, and who are also these youth that are being represented and going with the official national delegations that you have mentioned? Who do they represent? What are their demands as well when they are attending such a high-level conference? Going on to that, we'll give Hafsa the floor to also from your own perspective. I know you're not going to Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of in about. So what are your own perceptions? And Tfaddali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarine. And it's really both an education for me to be in these spaces. I hold my hands up. I'm not a climate specialist or an environmental specialist. I've been welcomed in this space and by many other organizations to discuss issues relevant to civil society in the region. And I thank ARI and other organizations that are looking to really be more inclusive in the discussions when we talk about civil society, because it's really important, I think, to remember that there is no separation when we're talking about climate rights or we're talking about climate action. It is very much an integral part of the broader human rights space. So it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to offer up some thoughts, bearing in mind that I am not a specialist who can talk very specifically to the asks and demands, and I myself am not going to COP. Really, for me, this conference and the broader questions have been about the host themselves and Egypt as a host, both opportunities and challenges. And I think really Rayan ended his intervention on the biggest question posing, or should be posed, not just to Egypt, but to the broader region, looking forward to the UAE next year as host. Maybe a different kind of spotlight on the UAE as a large producer of fossil fuels in that regard. But it's this question of transparency and accountability, this idea of tracking progress, providing evidence of these sustainable plans and promises. I mean, if you've been following climate financing, not from a COP perspective, but from a private sector perspective in Egypt, for example, you'll see that Egypt has acquired the largest amount of pledges for green hydrogen, renewables. It's opened the largest solar farm. There's a lot of quote unquote money in the renewable space. EBRD has just pledged a significant amount of funding over the next 10 years for climate supported or green projects, shall we say, green energy projects. And the question really is, both for civil society as a mechanism to hold governments accountable, but broadly for the entire region and for many states across Africa, is we are plagued in the global south by regimes and leadership that is inherently non-democratic, but by extension, non-transparent and unaccountable. How do we, as a body of experts, whatever your specialty is, but rights value-based actors and advocates, how do we impose that kind of accountability and transparency on not just the hosts in that moment on COP27, but as Rayan said, this is very much a global South kind of COP agenda. The Egyptians are really selling this idea that they can be the voice for the global South, the loss and damage, the mitigation, the funding, etc., that they really want to bring together all of these leaders from across the global South in this reckoning, if you will, with the global North. And rumors now that Joe Biden is set to attend, or at least is being pressured to attend within his administration and within the Democratic Party, would lend credence to the idea that Egypt is really trying to boost its diplomatic prowess. Building on that, there's been a lot of talk, not just about logistics, but also about intention of logistics. And of course, there is no doubt a country like Egypt that does not welcome civic actors, does not have a thriving civic space, would be open to welcoming tens of thousands of people from civil society, regardless of who they represent and why. And there are mechanisms to prevent that, suspended visas, delays in visas, raising of costs. Part of the reason, and not to give the Egyptians any real defenses, but Sharm is a safe space to host possibly up to 40, 50,000 people. You cannot physically do that in Cairo. Anyone who's been to Cairo, anyone who's visited Cairo, it is not somewhere that could hold a conference. You need something that is certainly accessible. People can move around on foot easier, or can move around without minimal delays and without bringing the entire city to a halt, which would happen in a city like Cairo. Nevertheless, what does Egypt really want out of this COP? It wants diplomatic recognition. And part of that has been driving opening their arms in a limited capacity to civic actors or civil society advocates that have a message to send or have a way to promote programs and projects that they're working on. Because what is Egypt really doing? It is selling itself as a government, as a nation, as a forward-thinking green actor. It's looking to sell everything. That includes the government piggybacking on civil society projects that are being conducted successfully, be they in Egypt or across the region where they can be transferable easily. That includes, that includes promoting its own government activities or PPP activities, ultimately for one reason: financing. And be that the broader climate fund, which Egypt has decided is top of its agenda to bring together actors from across the global South, or bilaterally. And one of the things that, I have been exploring in the future, thinking of this as a much more longer term program. In the immediate term, it's a 12-month Egyptian presidency or a 10-day conference. In the medium term, it's a 2-year regional spotlight with the UAE and Egypt. That's regional relationships, that's global South connectors, that's South-South cooperation, North-South relations, etc. In the longer term, it's the health of these communities and societies. It's about how do we survive? If you're in Iraq, for example, it is a genuine question about how do we mitigate these climate shocks and how do we mitigate the effects of climate change. In that regard, there has been a push-pull over the last 11 months or so between, I don't like to use the word, but traditional rights actors who, for obvious reasons, have been focused on political prisoners, the human rights space in Egypt, the closure of political space and civic space, versus the more climate and environmental minded who wish to see cooperation where possible for net gain, beneficial to the broader COP agenda and not detracting from the COP agenda. That is not to say that you can ignore Egypt's human rights record. It's not to say that it should be ignored. And it's not to say that protest in its truest form can or should be in any way reduced or critiqued or smothered in any way, shape or form. However, you do have to deal with the cards that you're dealt. You know, this is not a question of will Egypt host COP or can Egypt host COP. It is a question of Egypt is hosting COP in 4 weeks' time. There's been a lot of decisions made, and I think right ones, mainly that the global north need not just to take on the broader responsibility of representing inclusively, but also the burden of responsibility of having the voice that regional actors simply cannot, not just because of possible repercussions inside Egypt, but repercussions in their home countries when they go home. It is not a case that Egypt stands alone in this region where other countries in its neighborhood are welcoming of the kind of critique that Egypt would not be. I do not believe Egypt has learned a couple of lessons in their time, and one of those really is to not make spectacular mistakes in such a global setting. Risks of arrest are relative. That risk assessment is personal. It's very personal for people in the region. It's very personal primarily for Egyptians. But that means that the burden on civic actors who wish to protest, who will protest in the representing global north countries, have to carry the mantle that they represent global civil society in this context. And bearing in mind, and just to remind people as I wrap up, it will be the same next year. The UAE is not going to be any different, a changed circumstance greatly. In fact, when we get to the question of fossil fuels and emissions and that kind of conversation, one would argue might even be more contested in a context like that. Egypt is not a massive petrostate by any realm of the imagination. But just to finish very quickly to answer a question from Luca on the European delegations, really the idea is we have to work in the spaces that we have opportunity. Climate is a massive issue for European governments who wish to work with Egypt on climate and broader regions in the Middle East, which are the sunniest, which produce more power, which can build the systems to support renewable energy growth in many parts of the world. You have to look at conditioning your climate financing. We've had arguments over conditioning military aid and things in other contexts, in conflicts and otherwise. But when it comes to a rights-based approach to climate financing, that makes the most sense and that makes more sense. And I would like to see Europe do more of that in a values-based space rather than simply panicking because of its own energy shortages amid the war in Ukraine. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hafsa, also for bringing the global, but yet also positioning Egypt's and the role that is playing in global South actor, but also bringing on board the European also concerns and the position vis-a-vis Europe at the moment, specifically that Europe is going through a major energy crisis, and the cost will be more on our side to bear and support. But so from this, we will go to Egypt at the moment with Mohamed. Can also tell us what is going on at the moment. What are here? You've been actively involved on the ground. So the floor is yours. Tfaddal, Mohamed.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me well. As mentioned earlier, my name is Mohamed Kamal, and I'm the co-director of an organization called Greenish. I find it hard that you'll have to look at my face for the next 7 minutes. I usually prefer like a slide. Hopefully don't get too bored of my face. So very quick overview of myself. I am someone who's more involved, or I come from a background of waste management and plastic pollution, and I'm very transparent about this, due to COP27 coming to Egypt and due to us knowing about this from last year, from mid last year, we've been actively working more on climate engagement, climate politics, civic space with regards to climate engagement in Egypt, in the region, etc. And it's been an interesting journey. It's not the road to COP anymore, for us at least. Now we're getting close to the event itself. COP27 stays after the event. It stays, the presidency continues. So a lot of things have happened over the past year, and I probably would like to reflect a bit on that, reflect a bit on what we expect at COP, and really focus on the question of what is at stake for us, or for the, I would say, I'll probably speak on behalf of some Egyptian civil society organizations, not even all of the Egyptian civil society organizations. What is at stake for us at COP27? First thing I'll start with is the largely Egyptian civil society has not been, or largely has not been engaged at all with climate politics or climate activism overall. This is a new area for us to engage in. There has been individual activists over the years, or very specific organizations that have worked on these topics in the past, but it's not been something that we can deem a group has worked on in Egypt. And environmental sort of civil society space has grown over the past couple of years. And now with COP coming, probably the biggest positive, and I think Hafsa touched on this already, is the fact that there has now been space, whether it's a temporary space or a permanent space, it's another discussion. But at least for the past year, we've had a space to discuss critical, or have critical discussions with government, with different stakeholders, public sector included, and private sector, on key climate-related issues, on key environmental issues. We've been given the opportunity as civil society organizations in Egypt to discuss these environmental and climate-specific issues that probably, without COP coming, this wouldn't have been the case. Now, if this stays beyond the COP or doesn't, that's not a question for us to deal with now. There's a very big chance it won't. There's a very big chance it's just a bubble for the COP. But the most important thing is for us as a civil society or as part of civil society organization is to make the most out of this opportunity. Building on from that, Egyptian civil society comes in different shapes and forms. And maybe something I want to raise that has been a learning experience for myself. You already know the context of Egypt. I will not speak on that. You already understand. And if you don't, you should read before coming to Egypt on the situation in Egypt as a country, where Egypt is, the story that Egypt has gone through. The key challenge I have faced as a person, and my organization and other organizations in Egypt have faced, is we've been bombarded with journalists and media coming to us, asking us for questions. They want our perspectives on environmental issues, political issues, economic issues, things we've never spoken about before. So it was incredibly challenging. I'm an environmental organization. I'm not going to be giving a political opinion. And the key challenge I faced, specifically on a personal level, is a lot of the journalists come with their assumptions, and they don't give a space for an opinion that might not be in match with their assumptions. And this has made it incredibly difficult for us not to pass on the word or anything, but to operate as an organ, or try to get some form of validity thrown out of our mouths regarding specific issues. So navigating sort of this journalism attention or media attention has been very challenging. And I think this is a shared voice with some local Egyptian organizations as well, with COP coming. And I think it will peak probably over the next couple of weeks. Another thing is, and this is probably a bit specific to the Egyptian context, maybe not too much in the MENA region. Some MENA regions are more advanced at this, which is the climate narrative. In Egypt, we still very much lack a local climate narrative. Our climate narrative is very much not based on the local context. What does that mean? That means that when we speak about climate issues, we're largely adapting I would easily say, the Western narrative on what is climate change. And probably the majority of content we use is based on English. We don't have Egyptian localized content. No matter how much financing or how much you pump into adaptation projects, to have sustained adaptation in Egypt and local communities in rural areas, you need communities to be invested into these projects. Communities need to be part of the solutions. Civil society needs to be part of these solutions. And if they're not connecting to the climate issue, your adaptation project is probably not going to be very sustained. And Egypt is in dire need of adaptation. I mean, I know that loss and damage is going to be on the agenda formally, and the presidency has acknowledged that, but I'm much more concerned with adaptation. And I think I've mentioned this in one webinar before as well. I had a recent encounter with a person where we were just giving general climate change awareness and giving just terminologies such as loss and damage, mitigation, adaptation. And I got the simple question of, if we need loss and damage financing as a country in Egypt, isn't it probably too late? And that was an interesting question. I didn't really have an answer for it, but it further stresses in my mind the need to focus on adaptation. As a country, we probably cannot reach a point where our water security is so dire, we need loss and damage adaptation for certain areas. Anyway, these are 2 points I wanted to raise on this specific part. So what has Egyptian civil society done, and what is at stake for us at COP27? We've gone through a very rigorous capacitating sort of journey over the past year. As an organization, we've not been involved with climate negotiations, but now we're actively trying to get involved with climate negotiations for COP27. I'll be honest, we're not sure if this is something that's going to continue or not. The COP space does not seem like a very optimistic space. It's a very pessimistic space. The concept of meaningful discussions and meaningful dialogue is very limited. There's a lot of tokenism at COP, and I very much point towards the Western countries on this, because a lot of the positions that have been adopted by the Global South are based on stances that have been taken by the Global North and organizations from the Global North. So because of this sort of pessimism, I cannot say I'm probably interested to continue engaging with other COPs. As an organization, I'm very much interested to make the most out of the opportunity given here in Egypt. There's a couple of position statements and position papers that will be coming out and announced at COP that reflect the positions of different Egyptian civil society groups. I would like to shed the light on probably one or two of these position statements or position papers. One of it has been the works in a group of us that specifically environmental organizations have tried to come with a position paper covering thematically different areas in Egypt, and partially covers our global position, and a lot of it is aligned with the global positions taken by civil society overall across the world, such as the need to dedicate and to pledge with some form of commitment statement on the 100 billion per year pledge, the pledge that was previously made, but to date has not been actually implemented, 100 billion per year for financing. But the majority of our position paper is focused on the local context in Egypt. And I'll probably shed the light on two things. I probably don't have time to shed the light on too many of them. One of it is finance. So finance, and I probably won't speak on Egypt only. We need more money as a country. We need more money for climate-specific development. But it's really not just about getting more money. A lot of the Green Climate Fund projects across the world, when you start to assess them, the ability for monitoring and evaluation, there's a lot of things that are lost in the implementation. And maybe one of the positives that might come out of this COP is the more focus on implementation. But it's not just about getting more money, it's about what you'll eventually do with the money. And that's very important. And to segue from this point, we need more decentralization, and not decentralization that money goes outside of government. No, we have no issue with money going to government, especially in Egypt, but we don't want all the money to be poured in the hubs of Egypt, which is Cairo and Alexandria. The vulnerable communities of Egypt are not located in the urban hubs. Yes, urban areas are going to get a lot of impacts, but the vulnerable communities that we know of are not in the urban areas, they're in rural areas and the coastal areas as well. And these need urgent climate financing because things are not looking great. We're still pushing far beyond the limits that we're supposed to not be pushing to when it comes to global warming. Then the second part I'll probably talk about is in Egypt, something that's probably very important, but we still don't have any mechanism or clarity on how we're probably going to adopt this, is nature-based solutions. Specifically nature-based solutions in the context of urban environments. Egypt has the Greater Cairo region and probably the biggest urban zone in Africa, probably one of the biggest in the world. It's only getting bigger, and there's only more development to make it bigger. It's expanding at unbelievable rates. And one of the things that we've started to realize with regards to our local knowledge on climate change here in Egypt is if we really have any chance to adapt a region such as Cairo to climate change, nature-based solutions will have a long way or have a very important role to play. But it doesn't seem that there's any clear modality for us to use any nature-based solutions that we can start to adopt. There's so much gap on this, but there's so much discussion on nature-based solutions. So an interest of ours as local civil society is what can we do? Where is the science on this? What can we start to adopt? And then the other thing the other paper I'll probably touch light on is a document that will come out specifically talking on common requests coming out from Egyptian green, I would say, sustainability initiatives and civil society organizations that work in the environmental space on sort of demands. These are more demand-oriented. They're sort of common requests that we're sharing with the presidency, we're sharing in our context here in Egypt, things that we probably very politically put together, because to make a huge number of organizations agree on one thing, it takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort. So you have to play a lot of gymnastics with the words. And the one thing what we've eventually managed to reach is a set of demands that represent a large group of us on our local context. There's a lot of things related to biodiversity conservation, a lot of things related to just having an encouraging and empowering space for green and sustainable initiatives. Basically, just to conclude on my specific note here is Egyptian civil society have a spotlight with regards to COP27, rightly so. We have a responsibility to play in our local context. There are different forms of Egyptian civil society, and there's going to be different statements coming out of us. There's two things I probably recommend out of my statement is not to make any assumptions on the local situation based on one person's perspective, whether it be someone from government or someone from civil society. Please, when making public statements, especially if there are journalists in this call or any other call, please take into mind that your words eventually could have repercussions in the way you present them. Present the truth, be completely transparent, but do your best to be as objective as possible. And the second thing I want to say is even us as an Egyptian civil society organization, a lot of things are still not clear. We are approaching very carefully the COP space. There are things that we're still very confused about how to be coordinated. However, my general perspective, and again, this is a very subjective view, things will work out. There will be difficulty in accessing the space. Maybe the one thing I can't comment on is things related to visa, but anything related to movement within COP, logistics, etc. Most of this will be worked out. Do keep in mind that a lot of COPs have faced a lot of challenges. At least this is from my literature review that I did, and there was a lot of challenges in previous editions as well. And what we hope, at least, is that the spotlight in COP will remain on some of the key issues that plague us, especially in the context of Africa. And in this specific regard, I do have to say it's very frustrating to see Coca-Cola as a sponsor, especially as someone who works on plastic pollution. Very devastated. That's probably all I'll say. But from the other end, we do hope that COP will actually focus on the adaptation needs of Africa and the financing needs of Africa. I'll probably end here, and sorry if I took too long.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mohamed, for taking us as well, and all the responsibilities that you have been bombarded for the last year, maybe because the COP is taking place in Egypt. A lot of Western journalists, Western scholars want to know the local perspective of your own and others like you. So thank you as well for bringing us raising this issue. We will be taking questions. Anyone can jump in, but there's one question to Maymoona, but it can be addressed to others. I will read it out loud. I would like to know how you see the role of the GCC countries in funding the necessary activities for adaptation and/or mitigation. So if anybody wants to raise this issue and then this question, and then we can have others.
I can answer, maybe.
Yeah.
Although I feel like I'm being put on the spot, but no, the GCC nations, we know that they continue to contribute to climate change, through high domestic emissions and hydrocarbon exports. They are, however, also being faced with climate catastrophes as well, and they need to actually stand by their NDCs that are being briefly updated with targets every now and then. I don't know a lot about what's going on in the Gulf countries, but I know that KSA last year, just before COP26, they pledged to reduce its carbon emissions to zero by 2060, and I think they allocated 180 or 90 billion dollars to the effort. They also committed to reducing methane emissions by 30%. And we have in the UAE, for instance, they pledged the net zero by 2050. And I think Dubai is the only location in the region that have built any significant renewable energy capacity. And in Qatar, I think they have the Qatar Fund for Development, and we see a lot of projects funded by this national fund, governmental fund, and it has been. I don't think that the money that's been given out by this fund is very, very significant. However, we see a lot of mitigation and adaptation projects led and implemented by this fund. And I, of course, my colleagues here can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, thank you, Maymoona. Hafsa, yeah, go ahead.
It's just a really quick comment on the GCC net zero commitments. Something that has been sort of become a bit of a regular joke is that the loophole in the net zero allows countries to reach net zero, but not just in their own country's borders. So where their own countries' policies will not allow them within the geography but only of their borders to reach net zero, they're using money to invest in other green projects in other countries that would be offset into their own emissions targets and their own emissions numbers. So they will reach net zero, but they will not actually reach net zero within their countries. it's a joke. I mean, it's not a joke, but it's been taken as a joke. However, I think it's also a little bit short-sighted, because actually there could be great opportunity there to spread the question of, reducing climate emissions globally, because one of the things that has been a great critique of the global north within global north civil society itself is that, we don't solve climate change and its effects by one country, reaching a net zero target by a certain date or otherwise. This has to be a global effort. So, I think in that regard, the question of how the GCC can be more proactive donors in this space, especially when we're looking at a more than $1 trillion oil windfall just this year for those big, oil and gas producers, is something that actually could be a bigger discussion that takes us through to COP28 and beyond.
Okay, thank you, Hafsa. I think there are several questions that we'd like to take. Well, maybe we'll go through some of them. Like, there's a question addressed from Sarah. I have a question on whether the Egyptian government seems to be recognizing any pressures on human rights and civil society participation in light of COP27, or them as pressures, and not just the same person. There's another person who raised also similar issue related to meaningful participation, and we can have participants attend in Egypt, but will there be space for meaningful activism? So we're back to this inclusivity of activists and climate justice or even human rights organizations. So maybe Rayan or Hafsa and Mohamed, Maymoona, everyone is open, but we can. Rayan, go ahead.
Sure. Just to end it on the GCC, I think we've always spotlighted two things. 90% of revenues in the GCC are due to oil. They're coming from oil. The main investment they should be making is to diversify their economy away from fossil fuels. If you don't do that, you're relying on fossil fuels almost 95%. Second is Qatar, I think, third country in the world with the highest carbon footprint or ecological footprint. So as Hafsa said, if your direct net emissions inside your country become zero, that doesn't mean that you're not destroying the planet outside your borders. Total net zero emissions is what we need, and nobody's talking about it. Everybody's talking about direct within my borders, zero, but whatever happens outside is outside. To talk about inclusivity, okay. First of all, to say that the Egyptian government is recognizing or addressing any pressures, that would mean that I would have to see official papers, videos, webinars done by the Egyptian presidency that are addressing these things officially, or on their website to have a section about safety measures, something that is made from them officially, because I can't be speculating and saying that the Egyptian government is doing something or not if it's not official. What I do know is that I or the youth movement have not seen anything in that regard. Now, when it comes to meaningful engagement, I don't know what the youth movement in general is planning to do when it comes to activism at COP. I'm not responsible for that. I will, of course, be part of it. But when it comes to will they be heard, you will never be heard or change the game plan or the agenda during any conference. You do your activism for next year. Last year at COP26, we were demonstrating for loss and damage, loss and damage, loss and damage. And now it's happening. This year, we're gonna talk about loss and damage. So you don't advocate or do any sort of activism on the spot with an expectation that, oh, tomorrow everybody's going to wake up and take our demonstration into account. This is not how it happens. Countries already had their plans with their governments drafted out. Their delegates or negotiators already know the game plan based on their country. India didn't randomly come out last year and say what they said. It's all a game plan that has been written down throughout the year, and they're not going to change it because some activists went out. But they will change it next year. So whatever you're going to do this year, expect it to at least be on the agenda if you are successful next year. Yeah, back to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Rayan. I think around the inclusion, again, now we have seen, and Hafsa also mentioned it, and others mentioned it, like, you know, they're portraying youth groups and, you know, forms to say that we're moving into the green, into a more greener space and more greener project in Egypt. Whether this is true or not true, it needs to be very defined. For actually, who gets the chance to actually attend and be seated at the table with others? And is it the same type of groups, same organizations, same youth movements? And on, I think this is also one of the questions that was raised. I mean, the four of you can answer, and please feel free. Do you think that developed countries attack host countries that go through political uncertainties, or concerns to diverse the dialogue and taking some pressure off them, civil society organizations and other youth activists from the historical climate debt? One of the questions. Anyone wants to jump in? Mohamed, maybe from your side?
I can probably give an answer to multiple questions. I'll do my best. On the question with regards to what Western governments have as intentions, honestly, I have no idea how to answer this question. I'm being completely transparent here. Whether they do this to divert the discussion away from the key things that need to happen, or whether they not, usually these things are reflecting of a reality of some sort. So I guess it doesn't really matter too much what is being done to divert the discussion. So I'll leave it at that. The other thing with regards to the GCC countries, I was in a recent webinar as well, and this discussion came up. And the one thing I want to highlight is demand is king. So in Egypt, we have a lot of gas and we have a lot of oil. And I think I was questioned by a journalist, and this was in August, why don't we as a civil society organization sit with government and tell them to stop using fossil fuels and gas? Which is a very interesting question to ask of an Egyptian civil society organization. But what am I going to offer for them to stop? And that is probably the same question. They're getting demand from outside. Most of the oil and gas in Egypt is exported. Likewise with the Gulf. So if they're getting demand from outside, what is there to stop them? And what is the alternative for this cash flow? And this brings us up to climate justice or just transition, parts of that discussion, not all of it, of course. And I think this is something that needs to be brought on the table. There needs to be viable alternatives. And at the end of the day, demand will rule. So even if European countries, for instance, are talking about a lot of things related to their energy transition, they are still depending a lot on energy being generated from other countries, which makes things very complicated. I think with the other question on meaningful participation or activism, it's also a very tough question to discuss, because it's hard to see any form of activism not being meaningful. But in the COP context, I think just civil society participation overall, if you're just being there representing your organization and not being an expert at the negotiations, that is still meaningful to an extent. You are representing a community of some sort. And if you're someone who's actively working to disrupt the negotiations, to advocate and shout what's not being done and bring it to the media and make negotiators more on their seat, in one way that could be more, I guess, meaningful, but I see both equally important. It's equally important to have people who represent different communities and represent different contexts, even if they're not fully experts on the COP process. And it's also important to have the activists who've been working on this for years and trying to push everything forward. And yes, there are concerns on the attendance of many people to the COP. I do hope, and this is where we genuinely want the COP to be a space where civil society gets to have a voice of some sort during the negotiation process at the table and during the processes that occur, because I think in Glasgow, there was a lot more meetings behind closed doors, meaning there was less observers were able to attend. And I hope this is not a trend that continues to COP27, especially with the Ukraine crisis now. It's more likely to have more conservative sort of approaches taken from some European countries. So my concern is more discussions behind closed doors.
Okay, great. Maybe hear about, reparation, loss and damages, and also who will be, there are so many pledges, and we've discussed about this before, who will be responsible to actually monitor these finance mechanisms and commitments, because it has failed in the past. Why would it change now? If anybody wants to answer this. And the second would be, again, we're back to another question that around GCC, I guess GCC is the opening. So even if GCC countries will attain zero clean energy, they still have 0.03, okay, of the global map. Do you think world leaders may discuss global measures as they unify their efforts during the COVID times? So do you think that since we're all post Sharm el-Sheikh, will there be any unified position? Hafsa, yeah, تفضلي.
I just want to take this on because I am not going to even attempt to take time away from the experts on the question of reparations, and otherwise it's not my expertise at all. But this idea of, Mohamed raised it, Rayan raises it as well. What is happening in Europe is so key to this idea of, any form of sustainable mechanisms, transparency, the idea that Europe can suddenly, on a whim, because of this war, change or soften its language regarding not just its transitions, but the responsibility of other partners, both in the global north or beyond, on this question of climate change is really, indicative of where we still are globally as communities, as societies. I mean, talking about climate narratives, one would argue that we haven't even agreed a global narrative at this point, because we had one and Guterres has been championing that, and the IPCC reports and everything that have come out earlier this year was so damaging and the language was so hard. And yet the Ukraine war has turned everything on its head, that, all we're talking about is Biden coming to COP just to meet the Saudis to talk about OPEC? It's one question that's been thrown out and raised. I'm not suggesting anything, but that's how quickly geopolitics can shift the entire pendulum. And we can go back to a language that we haven't really used since 2015 or before the Paris Agreement. So, and not even looking 2 years down the line, what do we do if it is no longer a President Biden in the White House and somebody else in the White House? What do we do with the rise of populism in Europe that could politically change the approach? I'm British born and raised, and we now have a British Prime Minister who is looking to roll back almost all the climate commitments that her predecessor from her own party made mere months ago. So it's a really important question that we figure out a way to have a unifying position on the need, regardless of global conflict and geopolitics, for the approach to climate change, whatever the agenda on every COP agenda is from year to year.
Yeah, thank you, Hafsa. Mohamed, or Rayan, Maymoona طبعا as well, you can jump in.
I mean, I can just, since the topic of financial or financing mechanism has been brought up, I do agree that there are so many mechanisms that are being put in place. We have the global environment facility, and then we have the Green Climate Funds, and then we have the Adaptation Fund, and then we have the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developing Countries Fund. There are already so many mechanisms to channel funding to avert, or minimize or address loss and damage. But there's also this new trend that, loss and damage might have a special mechanism for funding, which is kind of ridiculous because, again, we have all those funds and they're not being used formally by those developed countries to provide funds for developing countries. Existing finance, mechanism are adequate, okay, and loss and damage finance, doesn't need a distinct or an additional finance for adaptation or humanitarian assistance or development assistance. So at a bare minimum, for me, COP27 should just kickstart a process to formalize funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage under the UNFCCC, and at the same time, initiatives beyond the formal, negotiations must also play a role to meet scale of, what is needed.
Okay, thank you, Maymoona. Rayan, yes, go ahead.
Maybe there were a few points that I really wanted to stress that I perhaps forgot about that you, my fellow colleagues, that you mentioned. First of all, the Green Climate Fund. What the youth movement is asking is stop providing the Green Climate Fund only for centralized bodies, which are governments. It's time for civil society to also be part of it. Now, if anybody works at the Green Climate Fund, they're gonna come, oh yeah, we're giving young people. Yeah, I know what you're giving young people. You're giving grants for $1,000 when youth organizations need around 200 to $500,000, to order to maintain their projects, their operations. So still, green climate funds, all the climate funds that are coming from the UNFCCC are going towards centralized actions. And that, as Mohamed said, if you want to take it down to local communities, you can't always be relying on centralized bodies. That's one. Second is, I spoke about monitoring several times today. I'm going to tell you a good example. UNICEF, for the first time ever, has monitored every country's national determined contributions for child-sensitive policies. And now they're going to publish this on the Climate Watch website, which is a website that monitors every country's emissions and their progress towards the SDGs. They're going to launch it on their website. So now you can take a look at each country in the world, whether their NDC like plans are actually child sensitive or not, whether they adhere to young people or not. This is what we want to see more of. This is what we're demanding. Show us more of this so we can monitor and progress. Third is about financing and about mitigation, about the 0.03%. Yes, I agree. We shouldn't fall into what the global North narrative is, which is focus on mitigation. No, we should be focusing on adaptation, but not only that, because as you said, these terms are from the global North. What does the Arab region also need to focus on or fund or, just laser focus on? Adaptation, yes, we know that. Diversifying the economy, nobody speaks about that because most economies in the global North are diversified. Wars, stopping wars, that's a big part of achieving climate justice. Who's gonna end the wars? Third is economic crises that are happening in the Arab world. Who's gonna stop these? Because society and individuals, they won't really mingle with you when it comes to climate justice unless they have a stable economy. I mean, it's clear. This is their priority. Fourth is occupation of countries. Who's gonna talk about that when talking about climate justice? How can you even mitigate or adapt when you don't have ownership of your own land in some countries? So these are very context specific to the Arab world that go beyond the words of loss and damage. You're not going to pay loss and damage for somebody who's occupied. You want to give them back their land. So these terms should be familiarized when we go to COP27. Say, hey, we not only, yes, of course, we will not prioritize mitigation, but it's not only adaptation that we need. We need to do all of these things to achieve climate justice. And this is what we're not hearing at all. And I mean, to also our fellow Latin Americans, Africans, you all have your own context as well. We have our own context. We're not unique. We're special, but we are not unique. You should also be familiarizing your own needs. If you have wars, bring it up. Whatever needs you have other than adaptation and loss and damage, I'm sure you do. This is what we're expecting.
Yeah, thank you, Rayan, actually, for bringing this as well. The concept, of militarization and the cost of war is completely absent in COPs, and it's bringing sometimes back, but it's very silent, if we can say. We still have like 10 minutes, so maybe if there are any more questions, please feel free to ask them. And I will give each panelist like 1 minute as as recommendations, but as well as what do you give as advice, given that we're like 3 weeks away from the COP. We'll start maybe Maymoona and then Rayan, Hafsa and Mohamed. Maymoona.
Yeah, thank you so much. I won't take long. I just, have this final thought. Again, people and the planet should be at the center of, global politics or the global political agenda and humanity's concerns. And the global north should recognize what they're doing, and what they could do now is own up to the promises and pledges. The global south should actually mobilize to refuse to be the basis or like the ground for carbon market offsets and unsustainable abusive businesses. And I hope that I'm attending COP27 and as a youth myself, I hope that us as youth, we can actually come stronger this time. And even when we come back to our countries, to our home countries, we'll be able to mobilize, we'll be able to raise these issues among our local communities, because the thing is just, so many people don't even know what's going on and how tense we should be at this point. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, great, Maymoona. Rayan?
Sure. To make this quick, I think when it comes to fear or misconceptions, remember the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that's a great example. You had a lot of fear, you had a lot of personal biases, negativity, and make sure that you know the right information, make sure that you are aware of your personal biases, that you are afraid, that you have a pessimistic maybe idea of Egypt or something like it might be true or not, but make sure that you rely on sound evidence published officially by Egypt or by the UN or whoever. Regarding all the thematic topics that we spoke about, I think if you want to wrap it all in 1 word or 2 words, it would probably be climate justice. I think that's the most term that can grab all these words that we spoke about today. Last but not least, if you're going there, please come by to the Youth Pavilion. I will be there most of the time. We could really demonstrate youth power together. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Rayan. Hafsa?
Yeah, I guess for me, the biggest, and I guess coming from a bit of a selfish perspective, as somebody who, through policy, research, advocacy, other avenues, is not an expert in this space, but desperately needs to understand it better. So I think for me, the biggest kind of recommendation I would give is, 1, to traditional human rights actors, is to engage in this space with humility. As people who have advocated for decades on the rights of women, violence against women, gender-based violence, political prisoners, civic space, all of these things might be bread and butter, but this is not an area that is, this is not an area that you can simply campaign on with a slogan or knowledge or one personality, one character, or one legislative change. This is about generational change. This is about global action. And it's about inclusivity on a level that we've never really explored before in civil society, both within ourselves and with the partners that we wish to work with. So to engage with humility and to embrace the climate movement and own it as a human rights movement. That is what I wish to see on a granular level inside Egypt. It's what I wish to see on the regional level, and it's certainly what I wish to see from government officials in global north capitals, in the UN, in regional governments, is this acknowledgement of the movement in that sense. And to give it that weight, that transparency, and that visibility, sorry, not transparency, the visibility that it deserves. And in tandem with that, to those who are attending COP and will attend COP, you know, come talk to people like me. Come and share your findings, your experiences with the think tanks that will publish your work, the blogs that will publish your 500-piece review on the COP process. Help support actors in the region to attend COP28. And of course, I know the registration process is completely different for Dubai than it will be or was for Egypt. But, you know, let's try and create channels of communication where we can pitch your work, express and allow you broader avenues, you know, the global American think tank policy community, all these different spaces where you may not have as much visibility as, you know, your traditional JCPOA negotiator analysts might. Let's work together, bring you in those spaces, have you report on COP, write up your experiences of COP, and also calls for action for the broader climate movement. I think that would be great partnership moving forward.
Great. I think it's a good way to put it, as a solidarity, global South, if we can say, as well. So maybe back to Mohamed, and then we'll wrap it up. Mohamed?
Thank you. I'll probably build on from what Hafsa is saying on, so I'll actually bring it back to the question, but building from what she said. So the question we had for today was, what's at stake for the regional climate activists in the region? And my answer to that is, for the next 2 years, the year that has passed and the upcoming year, largely these will set the scene for the climate civic space in the region. Or maybe that's an assumption. That's my assumption. My assumption is what happens, or what has happened this year and what will conclude over the next 2 months for Egypt, and then what will happen next year in the UAE, will largely set the scene for the climate civic space in the region. And this is an opportunity and a concern because a year has passed already in Egypt and a lot of key issues have not been discussed, whether Egyptian issues or North African issues or African issues, etc. That might be similar in the UAE context, I'm not sure. So my concern here is that if this was the settings, if we were supposed to set the scene for our work in our space for these 2 years, probably hasn't happened very well. And shedding the light very quickly on contexts such as Iraq, where they're facing a lot of challenges. The manifestation of climate change is happening live as we speak in the country on several issues, primarily related to water security and food security and agriculture, yet the spotlight is so weak. Yes, we're seeing documentaries, but the spotlight is so weak. So if this is the time for the regional civic space, yet these issues are not coming to be on the front line of what we're discussing, it's a bit concerning. And maybe the thing I'd like to conclude with fully, yes, it will. This time will dictate our civic space for the coming future. And there has been some advancements, and we're doing our best to make the most out of the opportunity to expand and be able to work more on climate engagement in the near future. But my experience, having worked on this now actively for the past year and a half, is there's one topic that usually dictates everything, and it's energy security. Or try to come or enter a discussion with, you backtrack it and it teaches energy security. You look at the US's commitments, you look at the European commitments, and they're all tied to their level or their general status with regards to energy security. It's not the same for water security, it's not the same for food security, etc. These are usually much more localized. But energy security just seems to be such a global problem and seems to dictate
Mohamed, we cannot hear you. Okay, I guess maybe we might have lost Mohamed. I've been going back to, we have like 4 more minutes for the panel. Mohamed, are you back or? All right. If you are still with us, you can jump in anytime. Otherwise, yes, we had
that's it.
The last points that.
That's the internet telling me to stop. So I'll probably stop there. It's completely fine. I don't remember where I stopped, so I'll probably just stop here.
Okay. Energy transition, and I think it's a good way to put it in a way. So again, I would like to really thank our four panelists, Maymoona, Hafsa, Rayan, and Mohamed, for being so open in your discussion, for giving oxygen in the darkness that we are literally living, as you can see in the back of Lebanon, and for bringing us, some hope as to reflect of where we are heading as a whole group, if we can say, whether when it comes to civil society mobilizations, movements, but as well as raising pertinent questions and pushing our battle, if we can say, on climate justice and climate as a human rights and as a rights issue. So on behalf of the Arab Reform Initiative, I'd like to thank you. I'd like also to thank our active participants who were with us in the room and engaging. And I would like to thank, our soldiers behind the scenes, Camille, Andrew, and Saeed, who have been supporting us to bring this webinar together. And we will be actually, as ARI, we will be publishing on the Conference of Parties globally, but as well as how this Conference of Parties is affecting the region, tackling issues of energy transition and social justice and just transition from perspectives from within, if we can say, and perspectives from voices from the region. So please stay tuned to our webinars and our activities, and log in to our newsletters, and hopefully you will hear back from us in the coming weeks. Good luck for everyone, and again, thank you so much. Goodbye.